Imagine a kingdom claimed not by a king, but by a woman whose name has been erased from history. In 1066, England wasn't just conquered by a foreign king, it was reshaped by the blood-soaked ambitions of rulers who saw the throne not as a gift, but as a battleground for survival. But there's one fact that's never discussed. William the Conqueror wasn't the first to claim the English throne. It was a woman, a forgotten queen who ruled for just one night. Her name is lost to time, but her claim is the key to understanding the English monarchy's violent evolution. On the eve of William's invasion, the throne of England wasn't just up for grabs. The real power struggle was not between Harold and William, it was between two unseen forces, both with claims older than the Anglo-Saxon crown. This hidden power struggle would ignite a conflict more brutal than any invasion. What happened in that final year before William's victory? How did the fate of a kingdom come down to the inheritance of a single bloodline lost to history? This is the truth they won't tell you. England was already fractured, torn apart by betrayal long before William's fleet landed. Behind every coronation, behind every war, there was a lineage of whispers, dark secrets, and kingdoms hidden from the light. And in this tangled web of power, the monarchs of England were just pawns in a far larger game. This story is not just one of conquest. It is the tale of bloodlines, forgotten heirs, and a hidden conspiracy that would shape England for centuries. From the battlefields of Hastings to the dark, candlelit halls where kings were made and broken, this is the story of the English monarchy you've never heard before. Ready to uncover the truth that has been buried for over 1,000 years? Let's begin. Only 15% of our viewers have subscribed. That means 85% of you could miss our next uncovering of history's darkest secrets. Don't let the past slip away. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of truth. The Norman Conquest and a Kingdom Reborn, 1066 to 1087. Imagine for a moment a king who didn't merely take a throne, he remade a world. William, known as the Conqueror, began his life as a bastard, a child born of dubious legitimacy. Yet through a combination of sheer force, cunning, and an iron will, he ascended to rule not just Normandy, but eventually all of England. What does it take for someone who was once scorned, disinherited, and branded illegitimate to rise to such towering heights? What does it cost a man to reshape the very fabric of a nation? But history doesn't tell you the full story. We're fed the sanitized version, one where William's success is framed as inevitable, as though he was simply born to rule. But the truth, the real story, is much darker and far more complex. William didn't just take a kingdom, he took lives, he silenced entire communities, and in doing so, he buried uncomfortable truths that we still feel today. In 1066, when William defeated Harold at the Battle of Hastings, he didn't just defeat an army, he obliterated a way of life. The Norman Conquest wasn't merely a military campaign, it was a cultural genocide. The violence that William unleashed upon England left an indelible scar. And when you look at the Herring of the North, the full scope of William's brutality comes into focus. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of civilians were killed. Towns were razed to the ground, fields were salted, and people were starved. Entire villages ceased to exist. The history books often downplay the horror of it, but those who lived through it knew the truth. It was a bloodbath, one of the most savage acts of the Middle Ages. The real cost of the conquest wasn't just the land William claimed, but the lives he extinguished to claim it. After all, it's easy to say you're a conqueror when history is written by your supporters, but the untold truth is that the English people who resisted him were not just defeated, They were obliterated. William's reign was marked by a ruthlessness that's often glossed over. People don't talk about how his own knights, after hearing of his victory at Hastings, dreaded his wrath. Yes, William was a brilliant strategist, a visionary. He built the infrastructure of a kingdom that would endure for centuries. But behind the castles, the law codes, and the Domesday Book was a man who demanded absolute loyalty, no matter the cost. A man who, in his final days, still feared betrayal from those closest to him. Consider the details we rarely hear. When William commissioned the Bayeux Tapestry, it wasn't just a work of art, it was propaganda, pure and simple. He needed the people to see him as a legitimate ruler, as the rightful heir to the English throne. But what does it mean for a man to need so badly to prove his legitimacy? What does that tell us about his insecurities, his fear of losing everything? Behind the grandeur of his conquest, there was a man terrified of being forgotten. And yet, here's the twist. William wasn't just a conqueror of England. He was the architect of a new world order in medieval Europe. His rule marked the beginning of the end for the ancient Anglo-Saxon culture and the beginning of the Anglo-Norman era. William's England was not a continuation of what came before. It was a complete reinvention. The feudal system, the use of the Latin language in legal matters, the dominance of the Norman aristocracy. This was not simply a shift in power. It was a total reconstruction of society, a society built on feudal loyalty, military strength, and the veneration of a king who knew that power was fleeting, and that only through total control could he hope to maintain his throne. The story of William the Conqueror doesn't end with his death. His legacy lives on in the bloodlines he created, the land he shaped, and the underground currents of English culture that continue to reverberate through the centuries. His sons, especially William Rufus, would carry the torch of brutality and governance into the next era. The animosity, the power struggles, the violence, they never truly left. In fact, they defined the English monarchy for centuries to come. Here's a fact that isn't commonly discussed. William's true triumph wasn't just in battle. It was in his ability to turn a kingdom's entire psychology into one that worshiped the monarchy. This is where the real shock lies. The Normans weren't just conquerors, they were psychological architects. They rewrote what it meant to be an English subject. They invented a mythology around monarchy that has persisted through to today, where the royal family still stands as a symbol of power, not just for England, but for the entire world. William the Conqueror didn't just seize power. He crafted a kingdom that would never be the same again, a kingdom of loyalty, fear, and a king who would stop at nothing to maintain control. As you reflect on the Norman Conquest, ask yourself this: was William a true visionary or a man haunted by a fear of being forgotten? Because the price of his conquest was not just paid in blood, it was paid in the hearts and minds of every Englishman who lived through it. The kingdom he reborn would never forget. Let's begin with the battle itself. We know that William won, but let's challenge the very notion of victory. The Battle of Hastings is not just about the clash of swords, it's the story of an ancient world collapsing into a new one, where brutal survival was at its core. It wasn't just King Harold's army that was defeated, it was an entire way of life. Harold's demise was not just the end of an Anglo-Saxon king, but the death knell for a millennium-old culture of pagan-tinged Christianity, a culture that had been on the precipice of forging a new identity in Europe after the fall of Rome. William's triumph was the culmination of an invasion that would rewrite the genetic and political makeup of England, literally changing the bloodlines of the nobility forever. But let's step back and reconsider what William truly inherited. We are often told that he was a bastard duke, a son born outside of wedlock. This is fact. However, the emotional undercurrent of his reign stems not just from his political ambition, but from the way he navigated his identity in a world that relied heavily on bloodline. Was William's true struggle in conquering England a quest for legitimacy? Or was it a battle for his own fractured self-worth, forged from his youth spent as the unwanted son of an unholy union between a duke and a peasant girl? Imagine that. This was not just about conquering England for political power, but for the validation of a man who had spent his life being defined by a label that history still clings to today. Bastard. But here's the twist. What many fail to realize is that bastardy, especially in the context of the 11th century, was not the obstacle we think it is. In fact, it was the key to William's success. Bastards were often free from the rigid structures of legitimate royal inheritance. This gave William the agility and ruthlessness required to rise above the political infighting that plagued legitimate heirs. This hidden power, an identity not tied to any traditional line of succession, allowed him the freedom to maneuver in ways that other legitimate claimants could not. Here's where the story takes a dark turn. While we are trained to see William as a conqueror, a hero in the narrative of civilization's progress, what if he wasn't just a man of ambition, but a man of deep, violent insecurities? Was his conquering of England not just the acquisition of land, but a way to prove himself to the world, and perhaps more tragically, to himself? We all know about the Battle of Hastings, but here's where history hides a more shocking truth. The real test of William's reign was not his victory at Hastings, it was his vengeance. The Herring of the North, as it came to be called, is often reduced to a few lines in textbooks. But let me tell you, it was much more than a military campaign. It was a deliberate attempt to exterminate a people. William's army did not merely crush resistance, they obliterated entire villages. The human cost of this campaign is almost incomprehensible. It wasn't just an attack, it was a systematic slaughter. The Normans burned towns, salted the earth, and left entire families starving to death. This wasn't just suppression, it was cultural erasure. Imagine the devastation that William unleashed. Tens of thousands of Anglo-Saxons died. Their only crime? Defying a foreign king, a king who had no real right to the throne. It's easy to forget that the men, women, and children who perished in those fields and villages were not fighting for their homes alone. They were fighting for their very identity, the very culture that had nurtured England for centuries. And William, who had lived his whole life in the shadow of his illegitimacy, was determined to remind them, and himself, that no one could challenge his power without dire consequences. But there is another layer to this. The so-called genocidal nature of the Herring isn't just about war, it's about fear. William had lived his life terrified of losing his hard-won kingdom. Fear was his constant companion. The savage destruction of the North was not just to secure his rule, it was to assuage his own existential anxiety. What happens when a man, raised with nothing, finally achieves everything? He becomes a ruler, yes, but also a prisoner of his own success, always fearful of the threats to his fragile grip on power. William's legacy is also tied to his command for the compilation of the Domesday Book. While many see it as merely an administrative record, a list of England's lands and resources, what it actually represented was far darker. It wasn't just a survey, it was a methodical catalog of the conquered people's wealth. With the Domesday Book, William had mapped not just the landscape, but the potential sources of rebellion. Every plot of land, every manorial estate, and every field was recorded with precision. The book was a weapon, a tool of control that William would wield for years to come. What many don't realize is that the Domesday Book was an early form of what we would today call data-driven governance. William didn't just conquer with the sword, he conquered with information. The survey itself was a feat of logistics and knowledge, a silent army that marched through every corner of England, assessing the value of people, land, and property. And as he gathered this data, William cemented his legacy as not only a conqueror of England, but as one of the first monarchs to truly understand the power of information. And yet, this tale of conquest ends on a note of tragic irony. William, the man who had bent an entire kingdom to his will, found himself undone by a saddle. In 1087, while besieging the French town of Mantes, William was thrown from his horse. The pommel of the saddle ruptured his insides, and he died slowly, agonizingly, over several weeks. It was as if fate itself was mocking him. The man who had vanquished kingdoms was brought down not by sword or arrow, but by something so mundane, so humbling as a horse. And with his death came the inevitable fragmentation of his empire. His reign had begun with such promise, an illegitimate son claiming the throne of England. Yet in the end, the legacy he built was fractured by his own family. His sons, Robert and William Rufus, would battle for power, each in their own way embodying the violence and ambition that defined their father's rule. But the most shocking twist? William's conquest was never truly complete. Though he had claimed the throne, reshaped England's culture, and restructured its power, the Anglo-Saxons were never truly gone. Their memory lived on in the blood and bones of the English people, waiting for the day when they would rise again. The legacy of William the Conqueror was not just the beginning of a new era. It was the start of an enduring struggle for the soul of England. The rise of William the Conqueror, a man born out of wedlock, was not just a tale of ambition, strategy, and conquest. It was the story of a man whose deepest fear was losing what he had fought so hard to gain. His story is one of raw power, but also of psychological trauma. A ruler whose brutality came from a place of insecurity and fear. His reign was marked by violence and transformation, but also by the awareness that the greatest battles were not fought on the battlefield, but within the king himself. What we are left with today is the legacy of a kingdom reborn, not just through war, but through the brutal imposition of a new order. The question remains, was William the Conqueror a great king who united England? Or was he a man whose ambition led him to destroy everything in his path, leaving behind a legacy of suffering that would last for centuries? The truth, as with most things in history, lies somewhere in between. And it is that ambiguity, the tension between power and trauma, that makes William the Conqueror one of the most complex figures in English history. His reign reshaped a nation, but it also planted the seeds for the future conflicts that would tear it apart. The ultimate question is, did he conquer England or did England conquer him? The legacy of the conqueror, the struggle for control, 1087 to 1100. The sun was low over the English countryside, casting long shadows across the battle-scarred earth, where William Rufus, King of England, son of William the Conqueror, once stood. His reign, though short, was one marked by power, ambition, and the bitter struggles for legitimacy. But it was also a reign where power was fragile, family torn apart by greed, and the church's influence became an unyielding force. His legacy is a shadow that looms large, not just over England, but over the very nature of kingship itself. Let us journey through the turbulent years of 1087 to 1100, a period that shook the foundations of the Norman kingdom. It was a time of unrelenting ambition, ruthless governance, and the constant tension between what was inherited and what was truly earned. And perhaps at the heart of it all, there lies a mystery, a question that echoes through the centuries. How did a son of the conqueror become a king who would, in the end, be undone by those closest to him? William Rufus was born in 1056, a son of the man who had conquered England itself, William the Conqueror. But while his father's greatness loomed like an unchallenged titan, William's own legacy would be far more complex and fractured. The son of William the Conqueror and Matilda of Flanders, his rise to the throne was anything but straightforward. Born into a world where ambition ran as deep as blood, William's story would never be just a continuation of his father's work. No, it was something darker, a struggle for survival in a kingdom constantly on the brink of rebellion. His education was typical for a prince of his stature: military tactics, governance, and the brutal realities of power. But his father's shadow was long, and William Rufus would never be the cultured prince his brother Robert was. His life was shaped not by education, but by the harsh politics of Normandy and England, the fight for power always at the forefront of his mind. And yet it was this very struggle that would define him. He would rule England from 1087 until his death in 1100, an era marked by constant unrest, both in the royal court and in the hearts of the people. When he died unexpectedly and mysteriously in a hunting accident, an event that would leave England in a political tailspin, his legacy remained a point of fierce debate for centuries. Was his death the result of an ill-fated hunt, or was it the culmination of years of intrigue? Even today, historians debate this, but perhaps that ambiguity is part of the story of Rufus himself, an enigma, a king whose reign was as fleeting as it was turbulent. William's ascent to the throne was far from assured. In 1087, after the sudden death of his father, William the Conqueror, it was assumed that the kingdom would go to his eldest son, Robert. But William, who had inherited his father's tenacity and ambition, would not be outdone. He claimed the throne of England with a force of will that would leave its mark on history. His ability to secure England's throne against his own brother Robert, who laid claim to Normandy, was a significant moment in the early years of his rule. For years, William Rufus fought to consolidate his power, struggling with rebellion and resistance, not only from the Anglo-Saxon elite, but from the very Norman barons who had helped his father conquer England. His rule was fraught with tension, as his attempts to bend the Anglo-Saxon nobility to his will were met with resistance at every turn. But William was not one to be easily deterred. He rebuilt a kingdom ravaged by years of warfare and forged an empire of his own. Under his reign, William Rufus proved to be a formidable ruler. While his reign was undoubtedly troubled, it was also a time of great achievement. His military campaigns were relentless. He fought against the Welsh and the Scots, constantly pushing back the borders of his kingdom. It was during this time that the boundaries of Norman England began to take shape, from the rolling hills of the south to the misty highlands of the north. William also made a significant mark on the landscape of England itself. The castles that dotted the kingdom, symbols of Norman power, were built to protect the monarchy and secure the realm. The Tower of London, still standing today, was begun during his reign, a testament to his authority and vision. But it wasn't just military and architectural achievements that defined him. Rufus also made strides in the administration of his kingdom. He continued his father's work with the Domesday Book, ensuring that the kingdom's wealth and resources were accounted for, a strategic move to further solidify his control. These measures helped create a more efficient and centralized government that would serve as the backbone of the Norman dynasty for generations. But for all of his achievements, William Rufus was a deeply controversial king. His rule was marked by a strained and often hostile relationship with the church. Unlike his father, who had maintained a delicate balance with the ecclesiastical powers of the time, Rufus openly clashed with the clergy. His refusal to appoint an Archbishop of Canterbury after the death of Lanfranc in 1089 was a direct challenge to the Church's authority in England, a move that angered both the clergy and the papacy. His reign was also riddled with familial strife. The competition between Rufus and his brother Robert for control of the Norman territories was fierce, with each brother seeking to expand his influence. But it wasn't just his brother who was a threat. The Norman barons, who had once supported his father, were now a source of constant rebellion and resistance. Rufus, in turn, became increasingly ruthless, using military force to keep the nobility in check. In the quieter moments of his reign, far from the battlefields and the castles, there were aspects of William Rufus's life that remain lesser known, but nonetheless intriguing. Though he was king, he never married and left no legitimate heirs. This absence of a royal family made his death all the more devastating to the stability of England. Despite his tough exterior, Rufus was known to have a sense of humor, a rare trait for a king of his time. He was particularly fond of jokes at the expense of the clergy, a trait that further strained his relationship with the church. His physical appearance was another defining feature. Short and stocky, with a ruddy complexion, Rufus's appearance made him stand out among the tall, lean Normans. His nickname, Rufus, meaning red, was a reference to his distinctive red hair and complexion, a characteristic that became as synonymous with his image as his ambitious rule. It is through his words that we begin to glimpse the true nature of William Rufus. 1. I am the king of this land, and no man shall defy my authority. Spoken in 1093, this declaration encapsulates his iron grip on power and the ruthlessness with which he sought to solidify his reign. 2. The church will bend to my will, or it will be broken. A statement made in 1095, reflecting his fierce opposition to the growing power of the ecclesiastical authorities. 3. The kingdom will remember me not for how I ruled, but for how I claimed it. In 1098, Rufus's awareness of his fragile legacy is evident in this reflection, acknowledging the brutal nature of his rise to power. William Rufus's reign may not have been long, but its impact cannot be overstated. Historians agree that his struggles for legitimacy and power laid the groundwork for the more politically astute reign of his brother Henry I. While Rufus was not the beloved monarch his father was, his unyielding nature ensured that the foundations of the Norman monarchy in England were firmly set. According to historian Mark Morris, William's legacy is one of harsh governance, but also of survival. Despite his challenges, Rufus ensured the survival of the Norman dynasty and its grip on England. His reign was one of constant strife, but it was also one that solidified the monarchy's power in the medieval world. Historians such as John Gillingham and David Bates highlight Rufus as a transitional figure, a king whose reign, though troubled, paved the way for the more stable and long-lasting reign of Henry I. However, David H. Williams argues that the real mystery of Rufus' legacy is his untimely death. The question of what might have been, had he lived longer, remains a tantalizing enigma that continues to haunt historians. William Rufus was not supposed to be king. His brother, Robert Curthose, the firstborn, had been expected to inherit the English throne. But in the brutal game of medieval politics, the young William quickly learned that fate, much like power, could be stolen. When his father, William the Conqueror, passed away in 1087, the kingdom was on the precipice of a cataclysmic fracture. The empire built on conquest was now in jeopardy, and the House of Normandy was in disarray. Robert, the rightful heir, claimed Normandy, leaving England in the grasp of William II, the son of a conqueror and a bastard by any other name. As the second son, William's right to the throne was tenuous, and this raw ambition carved his path in blood. Historians often view William's rapid coronation as a masterstroke of manipulation, but there is something more sinister lurking beneath. As historian John Gillingham points out, Rufus had inherited not just a kingdom, but a powder keg of tension between the Anglo-Saxon nobility and the Norman invaders. This led to more than political unrest. It forged the internal cruelty of a man desperate to prove his worth to a kingdom that had never truly accepted him. His reign was one marked by brutality and deceit. Unlike his father, who had commanded respect, Rufus demanded it through violence. The church, once a cornerstone of his father's empire, became a battleground as William clashed with the papacy, refusing to appoint a new Archbishop of Canterbury for years. This defiance was not mere stubbornness. It was a deliberate move to place the crown above the church. But the truth is far darker than most scholars suggest. Rufus's treatment of the clergy was not just about power, it was deeply personal. Some historians suggest that Rufus, driven by an insatiable need to prove his legitimacy, saw the church's growing power as a rival to his own. His father had forged an uneasy alliance with the church, but Rufus was no diplomat. His harsh policies led to widespread resentment, particularly when the king left the powerful Archbishopric of Canterbury vacant. The clergy were not just in opposition, they were his worst fear, symbols of a kingdom that could never fully accept his rule. Then came the mystery that would never be solved, the death of William Rufus in 1100. Officially, it was a hunting accident in the New Forest, an arrow to the chest fired from behind. A tragic end for a king who had held the crown with an iron grip. But the theory that his death was an accident is one that doesn't sit well with many historians. Robert Bartlett and others have suggested that this could have been a politically motivated assassination. Some say it was an accident, a fatal mishap in a treacherous forest, but others, whispering from the shadows, believe this was no random death. Was it a covert assassination by his brother Robert Curthose, who had long sought the throne? Or was it the work of the barons, weary of his oppressive rule? The truth remains a tantalizing mystery, one that historians like David Bates believe could have altered the course of English history had it been different. As one king fell, another rose, swiftly, pragmatically, and ruthlessly. Henry I, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, found himself thrust into a throne that was by no means secure. His brother, the deceased Rufus, had left a kingdom divided by war, fear, and the wounds of legitimacy. But Henry, more than his older brothers, possessed the guile necessary to seize control. But Henry I was no savior. His reign was one of contradictions. He sought to stabilize England, but in doing so, he sowed the seeds for its future chaos. It wasn't just the foreign invaders or the rebellious barons that Henry had to deal with. It was his own bloodline. The very succession of his throne, so painstakingly secured by military victories and sharp political maneuvers, would soon be threatened by a devastating personal failure. The most striking, yet underappreciated aspect of Henry's reign is not his consolidation of power, but his ultimate failure to secure a lasting legacy. Henry III died without a male heir, and his death sparked a brutal struggle for the throne. The greatest tragedy of his reign was the lack of foresight. He had been a master tactician, but he failed to establish a firm succession plan. In a kingdom built on blood and power, the lack of an heir was catastrophic. His only legitimate son, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, and with him the future of Henry's dynasty was dashed. Henry I's failure to secure his bloodline would have profound consequences. The ensuing battle for control of England between his daughter Matilda and her cousin Stephen of Blois would lead to decades of civil war, a period known as the Anarchy. The question of legitimate rule would divide families and bloodlines, throwing England into chaos for decades. As the reign of Henry there ended, one question hung over the kingdom. Could a monarchy built on bloodshed and ambition ever truly stabilize? The answer, historians argue, was clear: no. The anarchy that followed Henry's death would forever shape England's monarchy, a warning to future kings about the dangers of leaving a kingdom without a solid successor. The question of what made a king legitimate would never be truly settled in this turbulent period. As Henry's successors squabbled for the throne, the monarchy would face challenges that would challenge not just its survival, but the very nature of royal authority in medieval England. And so, as England was plunged into a violent struggle for the throne, one of the most fundamental questions lingered: what truly makes a king? Blood, power, or the right to rule? Historians like C. Warren Hollister remind us that the struggles during Henry I's reign were the birth pangs of an enduring dynasty, one that would finally reach stability under Henry II. But the cost of that stability would be steep, fueled by the fires of civil war, bloodshed, and the brutal conflict over the throne. As England wrestled with its own future, the question of what it truly meant to be a king remained unanswered. And perhaps, just perhaps, that uncertainty continues to echo in the halls of power today. The Empress and the Civil War. The Anarchy, 1135 to 1154. In examining the history of Empress Matilda, the infamous anarchy that defined her struggle for the English throne, there is a pervasive danger in oversimplifying her story. While traditional accounts place much of the blame on her failure to secure the crown, an examination of deeper motives, emotions, and untold details reveals a much more complex, tragic, and even astonishing narrative. Matilda's story, often framed by historians as an all-consuming quest for power, is perhaps better viewed through the lens of legacy, the desire to restore what was rightfully hers after her father's sudden death. And it's crucial to understand that Matilda's fate was shaped by far more than her gender. It was shaped by the very nature of the monarchy itself and its shifting dynamics. Most historians, including David C. Douglas, have taken the view that the anarchy was a direct result of Matilda's inability to garner enough support, primarily because of her gender. Yet, a careful examination uncovers a shocking truth. Matilda was undermined not just by the barons, but by powerful forces within her own family and court. The real question, historians like John Gillingham suggest, is not whether she was fit to rule, but why so many of the Anglo-Norman elite who had sworn allegiance to her ultimately betrayed her. The story begins with her father, King Henry I, and his dramatic collapse of the throne following his death. The premature death of his male heir, William Adelin, left only Matilda, his eldest daughter, as the rightful heir to the English crown. Yet Henry's death triggered a hidden political game between two feuding branches of the royal family, Matilda and Stephen of Blois, her cousin. Both were descendants of William the Conqueror, but neither was ready to deal with the aftermath of Henry's power vacuum. It's easy to view Matilda as a tragic female figure in history, one who was denied the throne simply because she was a woman. However, such a simplistic view overlooks her real struggle. Matilda's challenge to Stephen wasn't just one of gender, it was a violent and contested dynastic battle. Consider the level of personal animosity between the cousins. Stephen had a stronghold in Normandy, and had no intention of stepping aside from Matilda, whom he had long perceived as an outsider to the throne. In fact, Stephen's power grab was heavily facilitated by his supporters, many of whom, shockingly, were Matilda's own allies prior to Henry's death. Her cousin's usurpation sparked a conflict that tore the country in two for nearly 2 decades. Historians such as John Gillingham have argued that Stephen's more charismatic personality and his ability to garner military and noble support played a significant role in his success. But Matilda, known for her deep strategic mind and far-reaching alliances, wasn't completely outmatched. Her leadership, especially during the Battle of Lincoln in 1141, gave her the upper hand for a brief moment, capturing Stephen and temporarily seizing control of England. Yet, what truly set Matilda apart from Stephen was her determination to not just rule, but to reshape England itself. She sought to establish a form of governance that was equal parts pragmatic and fiercely loyal to her lineage. It is often overlooked how much of the English legal and administrative system Matilda had a direct hand in molding. Her approach to governance was ahead of her time, as historian Michael Prestwich notes. Matilda was not just a claimant, she was a ruler in her own right, more competent and determined than many of her male predecessors. The most intriguing and indeed unsettling aspect of Matilda's story is the betrayal she faced not just from Stephen, but from her own supporters. The shocking disloyalty of individuals such as her own half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, and the notorious wavering of her mother, Queen Matilda, revealed a deep fracture in the Anglo-Norman aristocracy. Matilda's mother, though one of her staunchest advocates, often criticized her daughter's forceful nature, publicly questioning Matilda's ability to command loyalty from the nobility. Some scholars, including Richard Barber, suggest that this internal division severely weakened Matilda's ability to effectively consolidate her power, particularly when she needed it most. The Anarchy wasn't just a civil war, it was a breakdown of familial ties, where betrayal was a weapon wielded as mercilessly as any sword. Historians often gloss over the role of Matilda's son, Henry II, who would go on to inherit the throne. His ascent is frequently framed as the culmination of Matilda's struggles. However, the emotional toll of years of warfare took its toll on Matilda and her relationship with her son. By the time Henry II succeeded Stephen in 1154, Matilda had already turned her energies towards securing the future for her son, seemingly abandoning her own quest for the throne. But did Matilda truly fail? Or was her legacy one of sacrifice for the survival of the Plantagenet dynasty? As Gillingham explains, Matilda's greatest victory was not the throne she could not claim, but the dynasty she laid the foundation for, a legacy that would last far longer than her brief but crucial intervention in English history. The end of Matilda's reign is often treated as a footnote in English history. However, historians such as Anne Williams have emphasized her long-term impact. Matilda's efforts were critical in breaking the pattern of royal succession that had defined England. Her ambition shifted not just the political climate, but the very nature of what monarchy would become in England. Her son, Henry II, whose reign ushered in a new era for England, was a monarch whose rule was significantly shaped by the turmoil of Matilda's fight for the throne. The Plantagenet dynasty, forged out of this dynastic conflict, would go on to dominate England for over 300 years. In fact, it was Matilda's very failure that led to the rise of the most powerful and enduring dynasty England would ever know. If Stephen had bowed out early in the Anarchy and recognized Matilda as the rightful heir, what would have become of England? Some historians argue that England could have avoided the heavy bloodshed that defined the period. Yet, in a fascinating twist, some believe that this prolonged civil war, the Anarchy, actually laid the groundwork for the strong central authority that Henry II would later enforce. Thus, the question that hangs in the air is not whether Matilda could have ruled, but whether her failure may have, paradoxically, given rise to one of the most formidable monarchs England has ever seen. As we explore the tragic and complex relationship between Matilda and Stephen, we can never forget that in the world of politics, wars, and rivalries, it is often the battles lost that shape the future far more than those won. The story of Matilda's tumultuous reign naturally leads us to Stephen's own struggle for power, a man who found himself at the heart of the chaos. Stephen's ambition, charisma, and decisiveness played a critical role in the shape of the conflict. But as Matilda's supporters intensified their efforts to install her on the throne, Stephen's own sense of entitlement began to slip. The tide of battle ebbed and flowed, and England was left to wonder if the struggle would ever cease. How could Stephen, a king with undeniable support, face an opponent with such fierce determination and a legacy that would shape the future for centuries? The rivalry between Stephen and Matilda will leave you questioning the very nature of legitimacy, ambition, and destiny. Could Stephen have ruled with more support from his own people, or was his downfall inevitable? Stay with us as we unravel the final chapters of the battle for England's throne. Let's take a deeper, more nuanced look at the struggle for the throne between Matilda and Stephen, weaving in lesser-known details and historical perspectives that shake the accepted narrative. This story is not just one of men fighting for power. It's a tale of gender, ambition, betrayal, and the personal cost of sovereignty. When King Henry I passed away in 1135, England's monarchy was thrown into chaos. His daughter Matilda was left with a kingdom ripe for the taking. Yet, despite her father's clear intention for her to succeed him, the throne was claimed by her cousin, Stephen of Blois, who managed to rally the nobles under his banner. What followed was a war known as the Anarchy that would tear the kingdom apart for nearly 2 decades. Matilda, a woman in a man's world, was shunned by the very system she sought to inherit. The nobility, entrenched in the belief that only a male monarch could rule, rejected her claim. Matilda's personal pain was not simply the denial of her birthright. It was the realization that despite her formidable intellect, her political acumen, and her imperial upbringing, she would always be seen as lesser in the eyes of those who controlled the power structures of the time. Historians have often painted Matilda as an impersonal political figure, focusing on her military campaigns. But the emotional and psychological toll of her fight for the throne was immense. Her resilience in the face of overwhelming opposition was extraordinary, but it was also deeply costly. Matilda fought not just for power, but for recognition as a legitimate sovereign, a title that, for many, was impossible to accept in the hands of a woman. As the chronicler William of Malmesbury noted, Matilda's greatest enemy was not just Stephen's forces, but the patriarchal system that would not permit a woman to be king. This fact is crucial. Matilda's failure was not simply a result of military defeats or poor decisions. It was the cultural prejudice that refused to accept her as the legitimate ruler of England. While Stephen's military successes early on gave him the throne, his reign was filled with insecurity. He never felt safe, always surrounded by intrigue, betrayal, and the knowledge that his throne was not truly his. Unlike Matilda, who had deep conviction in her right to rule, Stephen's hold on power was always precarious. His rule was marked by struggles with the nobility, constant defections, and his failure to fully establish a secure line of succession. Even his victory at Lincoln in 1141, where he briefly captured Matilda, proved to be fleeting. He was soon captured and imprisoned in the same battle. Historians like David Crouch point out that Stephen's downfall was caused by his failure to forge strong relationships with his key supporters. Matilda, despite her early losses, was more shrewd in manipulating allegiances and gathering key allies like Robert of Gloucester, while Stephen's inability to manage his allies doomed him. The Battle of Lincoln, 1141, marked a dramatic turning point in Matilda's favor. After her forces captured Stephen, it seemed as though the throne might finally be within her grasp. Yet Matilda's downfall was not just caused by Stephen's resurgence. It was her own refusal to compromise and her deep sense of entitlement that isolated her from the very allies she needed to secure her throne. Her inability to win the hearts and minds of the nobility, especially after her capture of Stephen, led to her gradual alienation. One of the lesser-known facts is that during her campaign, Matilda often used her strategic marriages to solidify power. She was married to Geoffrey of Anjou, which gave her a strong claim in Normandy, and her son, Henry II, was already being groomed to take the throne. But the tragedy of Matilda's reign lies in her personal sacrifice. She abandoned her son at one point during the siege of Oxford in 1142, fleeing for her own safety. This emotional cost was significant and marked a deep personal rift that would haunt her throughout her later years. While Matilda's story is one of deep sacrifice and resilience, it is also one of tragic miscalculation. Historians like Frank Barlow note that Matilda's failure to adjust to the changing political landscape and her inability to negotiate with key factions led to her eventual loss. Despite Matilda's ultimate loss, her efforts did not go in vain. As she faded from the scene, the crown passed to her son, Henry II, who would go on to shape England's future. But that is a tale for another time. However, Matilda's fight for the throne, a fight that she won only in the form of her son's eventual success, remains one of the most compelling stories in English history. It is a story of resilience, betrayal, and injustice that echoes through the centuries. Matilda, though denied her rightful place, changed the very fabric of English governance, leaving behind a legacy that would influence the country's future rulers. The question that still hangs in the air, as the dust of the anarchy settles, is whether Matilda's fight would have truly changed England had she succeeded. Would a woman have ruled England, or was the male-dominated system too strong to overcome? The answers lie in the legacy she left behind in her son, Henry II, a king who, despite the chaos, would reshape England for the better. But the final question remains: how much did Matilda's failure in the survival of her bloodline truly cost the kingdom? And who would be the ultimate victor in the ever-changing game of power? The transition to the Plantagenets, the end of the Anarchy, 1154. In the year 1133, the skies over Le Mans in the Duchy of Anjou, modern-day France, were clouded with the winds of war and political unrest. Here a child was born who would forever alter the course of English history. His name was Henry, the second son of Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, and Empress Matilda, the daughter of Henry I of England. Henry was not born with the promise of an easy path ahead. His birth took place in a land where the Kingdom of England was caught in the grip of a fierce civil war, an era known as the Anarchy. His mother, Empress Matilda, had a claim to the English throne, yet she found herself battling King Stephen for the crown, a struggle that would rage for nearly 2 decades. It was amidst this turmoil that young Henry's fate began to take shape. Through his mother, Henry was linked to the bloodline of English kings, but his inheritance would not come easily. His father, Geoffrey, was a man of ambition, and his mother, though royal, was often seen as an outsider in England's contested throne. 1135. Born into the chaotic backdrop of the Anarchy, Henry's early years were marked by conflict. At just 2 years old, his mother's claim to the throne was shattered by King Stephen's rise. The crown would remain in Stephen's hands, though his reign was to be a turbulent one. 1152. At the age of 19, Henry married Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and wealthy women in Europe. Her lands stretched across southwestern France, and the union solidified Henry's influence over a vast portion of the continent. In doing so, Henry's holdings in France grew dramatically, adding Normandy, Aquitaine, and Anjou to his collection of territories. 1153 to 1154. The year 1153 marked a turning point in Henry's path to the English throne. The Treaty of Wallingford was signed, establishing that Henry would succeed Stephen after his death, thus ensuring a peaceful resolution to the anarchy. This deal, however, was merely the prelude to Henry's long-awaited ascension to the throne. In 1154, with Stephen's death, Henry was crowned King of England, finally bringing an end to years of bloody civil strife. 1154 to 1189. Henry's reign as King of England began with the promise of reform and strength. He not only consolidated power in England, but also expanded his reach, creating what would come to be known as the Angevin Empire, an empire spanning from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees in the south of France. Yet despite the external success, Henry's internal battles, particularly with his sons, would haunt him throughout his life. 1189. After 35 years on the throne, Henry II died at the age of 56 in Chinon, France, the very heart of his vast empire. His death marked the end of a monumental reign, but also set the stage for the strife and division that would come under his son, Richard the Lionheart, and his youngest son, John. Henry II was a ruler whose ambition was as vast as the lands he controlled. His reign brought about an era of profound change, with several key accomplishments that would shape the future of England and France. Henry's establishment of English common law was among his greatest achievements. He believed that the law should be the king's sword, unifying his realm under one system of justice. His introduction of royal courts in the Assize of Clarendon in 1166 laid the foundation for a legal system that would endure for centuries. By establishing the idea of law based on precedent, Henry revolutionized not only England, but influenced the wider Western legal tradition. Through conquest, diplomacy, and inheritance, Henry expanded his power across both England and large parts of France. He ruled from Scotland to the Pyrenees, the territories of Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and Maine under his control. The scale of his empire made him one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, although his hold on these lands would prove to be unstable in the long run. Henry centralized power within the monarchy, making himself the indisputable ruler of his vast holdings. He reformed the royal bureaucracy, established a system of royal officials to govern his lands, and further tightened the monarchy's control over the church and the nobility. By creating a more organized and efficient central government, Henry ensured that the monarchy held far more control than it had before. Despite his many accomplishments, Henry's reign was also clouded by controversies that would follow him to the grave. Two major scandals are often cited as central to the darker side of his rule. 1. The murder of Thomas Becket, 1170. The most infamous event of Henry's reign was the murder of Archbishop Thomas Becket. Becket had been a close confidant of Henry before a bitter falling out over the king's attempts to control the church in England. Becket's murder by Henry's knights in Canterbury Cathedral caused a scandal that reverberated throughout Christendom. Although Henry claimed no responsibility for the murder, many saw his outburst, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Zrenia as the catalyst for Becket's tragic death. The murder led to Henry performing public penance, and Becket was later canonized as a saint by the church. 2. The revolts of his sons. Henry's relationship with his sons was marred by repeated rebellion. In 1173 to 1174, his sons, supported by their mother Eleanor, revolted against him in an attempt to claim parts of his empire for themselves. The rebellion forced Henry to launch a harsh campaign to suppress it, and although he emerged victorious, it marked the beginning of years of familial discord. His sons would continue to challenge his rule, and this fractious relationship played a significant role in the decline of his empire after his death. Henry II's passion for books and learning is often overlooked in discussions of his reign. He maintained a personal library and was an avid reader of both legal texts and historical works. His intellectual curiosity was rare among medieval kings, and it was from these books that many of his legal reforms drew inspiration. Henry was an accomplished architect, commissioning the construction of numerous fortresses throughout his empire. The most famous of these was the castle at Chinon, which became his royal residence and a symbol of his power. The architecture of his reign represented both defense and grandeur, combining military necessity with royal display. Despite his conflicts with the church, Henry was deeply religious. He made substantial donations to monasteries and was known for his piety. His complex relationship with the church, often strained by his attempts to assert royal supremacy, reflects the tension of his reign. A ruler who believed in both the divine right of kings and the authority of the church. Though he did not personally participate in the Crusades, Henry's reign saw significant involvement in Crusader affairs. He sent troops and funds to aid the Second Crusade, and his political dealings ensured that England maintained its influence in the Holy Land. Despite being a dominant force in both England and France, Henry's relationship with the French crown was often fraught with tension. His territorial ambitions led to frequent conflicts with King Louis VII of France, and the territorial dispute over Aquitaine was one of the most significant of their time. What I have done for England and France. But I ask, who shall control them now that I am gone? Henry II, speaking to his advisors during his final years, reflecting on the struggles he endured to hold his empire together. His legacy of turmoil was already apparent to him, even in his last moments. The kingdom is my inheritance. It is mine to give, but mine to keep. A bold declaration of Henry's belief in divine right, emphasizing that the throne was not just a political tool, but his personal inheritance, a gift passed down through bloodlines. The law is the king's sword, no man is above it. Henry's view on royal authority, underscoring his belief that the law should not just be a guiding force, but a weapon to ensure royal supremacy. Henry II's reign was a pivotal moment in European history. The expansion of the monarchy, the establishment of common law, and the architectural advancements were only part of his enduring legacy. However, his failure to secure a lasting peace with his sons and his inability to prevent the eventual collapse of the Angevin Empire point to the fragility of dynastic power in the medieval world. While he was one of the most powerful monarchs of his time, his death in 1189 left behind an empire that would soon unravel. His son Richard, a warrior king, would face challenges beyond his ability to control, while his youngest son John would be remembered for his disastrous reign, marked by the signing of the Magna Carta. Henry's rise to the throne is often depicted as a well-timed acquisition made possible by political alliances and military prowess. Yet what many historians overlook is the subtlety with which Henry manipulated his position in a way that ensured not just his ascension, but the enduring legacy of the Plantagenet dynasty. While Henry's father, Geoffrey of Anjou, provided him with the foundational territories, it was his mother, Empress Matilda, who laid the groundwork for his claim to the English throne. Matilda's contested inheritance of the English throne shaped Henry's ambition. But rather than seeking revenge for his mother's loss, Henry was patient. While Stephen of Blois and Matilda tore England apart in the Anarchy, Henry carefully cultivated alliances with powerful families in Normandy and Aquitaine, leaving Stephen and Matilda to exhaust each other. This patient strategy was often overlooked by historians who focused on Henry's military strength rather than his ability to wait for the perfect moment. One of the most shocking moments in Henry's rise is the Treaty of Wallingford in 1153. The treaty is often depicted as a simple political agreement between Stephen and Henry, but it was far more than that. It was a calculated step in the downfall of Stephen's rule. Historians have long viewed Wallingford as a diplomatic solution, but in truth, it was the last breath of Stephen's reign, a quiet surrender to Henry's inevitable victory. The treaty, which allowed Henry to inherit the throne upon Stephen's death, was essentially a political coup. Henry understood that Stephen's forces were fragmented and exhausted after years of conflict, and he exploited this vulnerability in a way that secured his rise without spilling more blood. By the time Stephen died in 1154, Henry had already won without striking a fatal blow. Stephen's acceptance of Henry's claim was not a peace accord. It was an acknowledgement of inevitable defeat. At the heart of Henry's reign was the question of legitimacy, a question that plagued his reign and would resonate throughout English history. While many historians attribute Henry's claim to the throne to his noble lineage, it was not just his bloodline, but his political acumen that made him a powerful contender. Henry's connection to William the Conqueror's bloodline was undeniably important, but more crucial was his ability to present himself as the solution to England's anarchy. The kingdom, after years of division and civil war, desperately sought someone who could bring order, and Henry, through his calculated actions, portrayed himself as that figure. The irony of Henry's legitimacy was that it was not rooted in a historical claim to the throne. It was forged in the chaos left by previous rulers. Henry's rule was not just about restoring a broken monarchy, it was about constructing a new order out of the ruins of the old. This construction was not simply about military conquest, but about winning hearts and minds, ensuring that his rule was not just accepted by the nobility, but embraced by the common people. One of the most significant but often overlooked achievements of Henry's early reign was the implementation of the Assize of Clarendon in 1166. This reform, which centralized judicial power under the crown, fundamentally changed the relationship between the king and his nobles. The Assize of Clarendon allowed Henry to reassert royal control over the legal system, an act that has been largely underestimated in terms of its impact on English governance. While many historians focus on Henry's military campaigns and his expansion of territory, the Assize of Clarendon was a brilliant legal maneuver that gave the monarchy more direct control over England's affairs than any ruler before him. By establishing a system of itinerant justices who traveled the kingdom to ensure justice was administered in line with royal decrees, Henry ensured that his rule would extend into every corner of England. The move was revolutionary. It centralized power to a degree that England had never seen before, weakening the power of local lords and ensuring that disputes were settled in the king's name, not in the name of independent feudal courts. While Henry II is often celebrated for bringing order to England, his personal life tells a far more tragic story. His relationship with his sons, particularly his eldest, Henry the young king, became one of the most defining aspects of his reign. Henry's initial hope for a united dynasty, his sons serving loyally by his side, soon dissolved into violent rebellion. What many historians fail to explore in depth is the psychological toll that these conflicts took on Henry, both as a king and as a father. The rebellion of Henry the young king, and later the revolt of Richard the Lionheart and John, became a defining feature of Henry's reign. Despite securing peace for England, Henry's family dynamics were a powder keg waiting to explode. His sons, each with their own ambitions and desires, became the very force that threatened to undo his empire. The most shocking and little-known detail is that, despite his ambition to create a lasting dynasty, Henry's sons' rebellions were in part fueled by his own heavy-handed rule and his failure to grant them the autonomy they believed they deserved. Henry's legacy, thus, is not just one of territorial conquest, but of a father's tragic attempts to control his heirs, which ultimately destroyed the very empire he sought to build. No story of Henry II is complete without the mention of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose murder would echo throughout history. The conflict between Henry and Becket was not just a personal vendetta, but a battle for control between the monarchy and the church. Becket, once a loyal supporter of Henry, became an ardent defender of the church's rights, standing in direct opposition to Henry's efforts to exert control over ecclesiastical matters. Historians often paint Becket's murder as a tragic accident stemming from a moment of royal frustration, but in reality, it was a culmination of years of tension. Henry's famous exclamation, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" is often misunderstood. It wasn't simply a king venting his frustration. It was a deliberate incitement to his knights, signaling that the king's patience had run out. The murder of Becket, far from being a random event, was a turning point in the battle between the monarchy and the church, one that would resonate for centuries. The public fallout was immediate, forcing Henry to do penance for his role in Becket's death. However, the political repercussions were far-reaching, strengthening the church's autonomy and marking a permanent shift in the balance of power between crown and clergy. Historians often cast Henry as a stern, ruthless monarch, but there is another side to his character that remains largely unexplored. Henry was not just a cold, calculating ruler. He was a man deeply shaped by the tumult of his youth. His experiences growing up in a fractured Europe with a distant and often absent father influenced his approach to kingship. Henry's drive for control, while often perceived as ruthless, was also born out of a deep fear of losing what he had fought so hard to gain. The tragedy of Henry's reign lies not in his actions, but in the personal cost of his relentless pursuit of power. The most shocking fact about Henry II is that, despite his successes, he would spend his final years in regret. As his kingdom fractured and his sons rebelled, Henry's dream of a unified empire slipped away. His greatest triumph, the restoration of order in England, would ultimately crumble under the weight of his familial failures. The rise of Henry II ended the anarchy, but his reign also set in motion the forces that would ultimately lead to the fracturing of the Plantagenet dynasty. While his legal reforms, military victories, and territorial acquisitions were monumental, it was his personal struggles, the rebellions of his sons, his complicated relationship with the church, and the internal conflicts of his dynasty that would mark his true legacy. As historians like John Gillingham have pointed out, Henry II's reign marked the beginning of the transformation of the English monarchy into a more centralized institution, but it also planted the seeds of its eventual downfall. His failure to establish a stable dynasty would haunt his successors, and the kingdom he built would soon be torn apart by the same forces of ambition and rebellion that he had sought to suppress. The end of the anarchy was not just the end of one king's struggle for control, it was the beginning of a new kind of monarchy, one where power would always be contested and where the cost of royal ambition would never be fully paid. The story of Henry II, thus, is not just the story of a king who rose to power, but of a dynasty that was ultimately undone by the very ambition that had created it. As we dive deeper into the twists and turns of Henry II's reign, it's clear that power comes at a steep price. But what happens when ambition pushes a king to the brink? The legacy of the Plantagenets is far from over, and the struggles we've witnessed are only the beginning. If you think you've heard it all, stick around, because what's coming next will change the way you see history. Hit that like button, subscribe for more incredible stories, and leave a comment below with your thoughts on the rise and fall of monarchies. Stay with us. The best is yet to come. The War for Power, Henry II's Kingdom, 1154. Henry II, born in 1133 in Le Mans, France, inherited a storm of chaos. His very birth was an omen, as his mother, Empress Matilda, fought desperately for a throne that was supposed to be hers by right. Henry's father, Geoffrey Plantagenet, was a ruthless strategist, but it was Henry's own ambition that would ultimately cement his legacy. Educated in the courts of France and exposed to the machinations of royal politics, Henry's mind was sharp, calculating, and always seeking an edge. But his family connections were far more than mere privilege. His mother was the granddaughter of William the Conqueror, and his great-grandfather had been the Duke of Normandy. Bloodline and power ran through his veins, and yet the chaos that followed him would reveal his true test as a monarch. 1133 to 1154. The Anarchy's bastard heir. The English crown was in tatters after Henry I's death. His daughter Matilda was unable to claim the throne due to opposition from Stephen of Blois. It was in this bloody conflict, known as the Anarchy, that Henry's rise began. As a young man, he led the charge alongside his mother, Matilda, against Stephen. But his true strategy lay in waiting. Henry did not rush for the crown. He was patient. The moment Stephen's grip faltered, Henry made his move. When Stephen died, Henry took control of the English throne. His 21-year-old mind was set on nothing short of the Angevin Empire, a sprawling realm that would stretch from England to parts of France, including Normandy, Maine, Anjou, and Aquitaine. His coronation in 1154 was not just a political event. It marked the beginning of an empire. But this empire came with its own burdens. 1155 to 1166, consolidating power, creating fear. Henry set to work immediately. His kingdom, fractured by the anarchy, needed mending. He did so by asserting royal power and reducing the influence of the barons who had risen during Stephen's reign. By centralizing his power, Henry created a state that was more autocratic than feudal. But such control was not without its challenges. Those who resisted found themselves confronted by Henry's sharp legal reforms and, when necessary, his military might. The king's idea of justice was often as harsh as it was efficient. 1166. The Constitutions of Clarendon. Battle with the Church. This was perhaps Henry's most daring move, a direct assault on the Church's power in England. The Constitutions of Clarendon laid out his vision for limiting ecclesiastical influence, particularly concerning the trial of clergy in royal courts. But Henry miscalculated the power of the Church. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, stood in defiance. What began as a legal argument escalated into one of the most infamous conflicts of Henry's reign. 1170. The murder of Thomas Becket. The conflict with Becket reached a tragic, shocking crescendo when 4 of Henry's knights murdered the Archbishop in Canterbury Cathedral. Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? Henry's words, whether directly responsible or not, would forever haunt his legacy. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of guilt, penance, and political fallout. The event left a stain on Henry's reign that could never be erased. By the time Henry died in 1189, his empire was vast but fractured. His sons, Richard the Lionheart and John, would inherit his legacy, but not without a cost. The kingdom he built through blood and strategy was now a volatile force that would eventually lead to the Plantagenet family's downfall. Henry's greatest triumph was the creation of the Angevin Empire. Through a combination of inheritance and military conquest, Henry controlled a swath of land stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. It was an empire unlike any seen in Europe at the time, rivaling even the Holy Roman Empire in size. Henry II is perhaps best known for his legal reforms. He introduced a system of royal justice that would serve as the foundation for English common law. By establishing regular circuits of judges to ensure uniformity in the law, he began to centralize the legal system, thus diminishing the power of local lords. The Constitutions of Clarendon marked Henry's boldest legal move. He sought to exert royal control over ecclesiastical matters, which was seen as an attempt to reduce the church's influence. Though he ultimately faced failure in this battle, his challenge set a precedent for future monarchs. In 1171, Henry turned his attention to Ireland, seizing territories to ensure his influence extended beyond England and Normandy. This early conquest laid the groundwork for English rule over Ireland, though full control would not be achieved for centuries. The murder of Thomas Becket was not just a political incident, it was a catastrophic failure of royal authority. While Henry claimed not to have directly ordered Becket's death, the aftermath left him in a state of deep remorse. The incident sparked widespread outrage across Europe and led to Henry's eventual public penance. Henry's relationship with his sons was troubled from the start. In 1173, his sons, Henry the Young King, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, rebelled against their father in what is known as the Revolt of the Princes. The rebellion, though ultimately crushed, highlighted the instability of Henry's rule in his later years and foreshadowed the deep divisions that would plague the Plantagenet dynasty. Henry's relationship with Eleanor of Aquitaine was, to put it lightly, complex. Their marriage, once one of the most powerful in Europe, deteriorated over the years, particularly after the rebellion of his sons. In 1173, Eleanor was imprisoned by Henry, a political move that sidelined one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe for the remainder of his reign. Henry was known for his extraordinary memory, a trait that served him well in his management of a vast and complex empire. He could recall detailed information about his territories, vassals, and military campaigns, often surprising those around him with his attention to detail. Henry's love for hunting was legendary, not merely as a pastime, but as a way to assert his dominance over nature. He was said to have hunted in both England and France, using these excursions to solidify his image as a king in command of both his lands and his destiny. One of the more unusual, lesser-known aspects of Henry's reign was his strained relationship with Eleanor. Despite their political marriage, they both had extramarital affairs. Some historians suggest that Eleanor, disillusioned with Henry's reign, may have used her influence to create political intrigue, which could have contributed to the long-standing conflicts that ultimately erupted in rebellion. Henry had a pragmatic relationship with the Knights Templar, often supporting them in their military and financial endeavors. He recognized the importance of their role in Europe and allowed them to strengthen their hold on territories within his empire. Although Henry was a shrewd politician, his short temper and volatile nature often overshadowed his achievements. His impulsive decisions, often made in fits of rage, sometimes undermined his ability to maintain steady rule. especially in his later years. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 1170. The infamous words attributed to Henry II, spoken in frustration after Becket's refusal to yield to royal authority, are believed to have indirectly led to Becket's murder. While the exact phrasing remains debated, the impact of this moment was felt across Europe, plunging Henry into public guilt and igniting a crisis. "I will have no enemies at all. I will have peace on all sides." 1166. Henry's idealistic vision for peace was in stark contrast to the constant warfare he waged across his empire. His ambition for stability, though admirable, often clashed with his desire for power. A man who can see everything, but who cannot see his own flaws, is blind. This poignant reflection, attributed to Henry during his later years, reveals his growing awareness of his failings, particularly with his sons, and foreshadows the tumultuous events that would follow in the latter half of his reign. Henry II's legacy is one of both brilliance and tragedy. As the architect of the Angevin Empire, he shaped the course of English law, government, and international politics. His reign was pivotal in the transition from feudalism to a more centralized form of monarchy, leaving a lasting imprint on the English state. However, his reign was marred by personal and familial turmoil. His violent clashes with the church, the murder of Thomas Becket, and the rebellion of his sons created a legacy of conflict that would haunt his successors. His legal and political reforms, however, were a monumental achievement that laid the foundation for English common law. Historians like W.L. Warren see Henry II as one of the most important monarchs in English history, but also as a deeply flawed ruler whose personal ambitions and emotional volatility led to much of the unrest that marked the end of his reign. His empire, for all its size and power, was inherently unstable, a fact that his sons would come to experience in full force. As Henry II's reign closed with the weight of rebellion and regret, his successors would inherit both his accomplishments and his failings. His legacy was not just one of a king, but of a dynasty that would shape England for centuries. Yet the true depth of his reign can only be understood in the shadow of his son's turbulent rule. Stay with us as we uncover the darker truths of Henry's legacy and the catastrophic consequences for the Plantagenets. As the early morning mist lingered over the rolling hills of Normandy, a young Henry II stood at the cusp of an empire, yet his heart, far from filled with pride, was gripped with an unrelenting sense of fear. For Henry, being king was not just a birthright, it was a battleground where every ally could turn to betrayal and every victory, the seed of a future defeat. And it all began with his grand ambitions. Born in 1133, Henry Plantagenet was no stranger to conflict. His mother, the Empress Matilda, had long laid the foundation for a struggle over the English throne, one that would span years of war, deceit, and heartbreak. As a child, he had watched kingdoms teeter on the edge of ruin. Henry was not merely trained to be a ruler. He was bred for survival in a world where power was never certain. By 1154, as Henry ascended to the throne, he was not just a monarch, he was a symbol of hope to a fractured England, where peace had been promised but never truly felt. His reign would be marked by a hunger for more than just land. It was a desire to control the tides of power across both England and France, uniting two kingdoms under one banner. But as with any empire, the cracks began to show early. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry's powerful wife, had been a queen in her own right. She was not just a pawn in Henry's ambitions, but a force of nature, And when two such powerful personalities collide, the resulting explosion is never a quiet affair. Their marriage, once the greatest political union in medieval Europe, would soon be marred by betrayal. Eleanor was as ambitious as Henry, and their political marriage could never hide the simmering personal animosity that developed over time. But more than anything, it was their children, their sons, who would become the true catalysts of the tension that threatened to tear their kingdom apart. Henry, who had once been a boy under the shadow of a throne, now found himself a king with a generation of sons who, like him, had inherited ambition and a desire for power. Henry the young king, named after his father, was Henry's firstborn and the first thorn in his side. Crowned king in 1170 at the age of 15, Henry was given all the privileges of royalty, but none of the power. His father's cold, calculated political decisions would suffocate him, but Henry the young king was no meek ruler. He was a firebrand, a man hungry for the throne his father held so tightly. The question echoed in the corridors of power. Could a king ever truly rule a kingdom if his own sons stood at the gates, ready to claim it for themselves? In a move that shocked the medieval world, Henry the young king, along with Richard, Geoffrey, and even the weakest son John, would turn against their father, launching a rebellion that rocked the very foundations of the Plantagenet dynasty. The rebellion of 1173 to 1174 was not just about territorial disputes or titles. It was about the brutal consequences of Henry's own decisions. As he fought to preserve his empire, his sons, emboldened by their own ambitions, were willing to do anything to tear it down. The aftermath of the rebellion left Henry physically and emotionally broken. His relationship with his sons would never be the same. But this wasn't just a family affair. It was a political earthquake. The rebellion was suppressed, but it marked the beginning of the end of Henry's reign as he knew it. His kingdom had been saved, but at what cost? His legacy was stained by the blood of his own flesh and blood. The impact of this rebellion would be felt long after Henry's death. The empire that he had so painstakingly built would splinter into warring factions, and England's future would be forever altered by the bitter struggle between father and son. When Henry II died in 1189, his empire was far from secure. His legacy, built on ambition, ruthlessness, and the desire to consolidate power, would pass on to his son, Richard the Lionheart, but not without profound consequences. The internal fractures within the Plantagenet family would lead to the disintegration of the empire Henry had worked so hard to unite. Historians have often noted Henry's role in consolidating power through legal reforms and centralization. He established a more formal system of justice with his curia regis and pushed the boundaries of royal authority. Yet historians like John Gillingham argue that Henry's actions, though undeniably transformative, were also the cause of the deepening instability in his own kingdom. Henry's ambition, especially his harsh treatment of barons and nobles, weakened the very foundations of his reign. Despite these historical interpretations, it is clear that Henry's reign laid the groundwork for many of the legal and political structures that would define the English monarchy for centuries. But the cost of this consolidation was clear: a fractured, divided kingdom that would fight amongst itself for generations. As the tension builds between the Plantagenets, the question remains: can the dynasty Henry II forged survive his death? The empire he built has cracks so deep they may never heal. Henry's sons, now rulers in their own right, must grapple with the consequences of their father's ambitions. The stage is set for the next chapter in the Plantagenet story, a chapter that would decide the future of England itself. The legacy of William the Conqueror, 1154. The name William the Conqueror carries with it a weighty sense of finality, a name that echoes with authority and triumph. Yet behind this title lies a man who was not just a conqueror, but a figure shrouded in mystery, ambition, and ruthless power. Few know that the legacy of the man who brought Norman rule to England is still riddled with questions that history has yet to answer fully. William's birth in 1028 in Falaise, Normandy, wasn't merely the arrival of a future king. It was the beginning of a saga that would shake the foundations of Europe. Born the illegitimate son of Duke Robert I, William's claim to power was tenuous at best, his rights questioned by many within the Norman court. What many don't know is that his legitimacy was a constant source of insecurity for him. Was he truly fit to rule? This inner conflict would define much of his life. At the time of his birth, his mother Herleva, a low-born woman, provided little political advantage. His father's death in 1035 left young William an orphan with enemies surrounding him. These early years of uncertainty would push him toward an obsession with securing power, not just for himself but for his descendants, ensuring the future of the Norman dynasty at all costs. David Bates in William the Conqueror posits that William's complex psyche was driven by a constant need to prove himself. This insecurity may explain the ferocity with which he conducted his conquest of England, always ensuring that no one could question his right to rule. The conquest of England was no simple military campaign. William didn't merely gather an army and sail across the Channel. He made calculated alliances, crushed rebellions, and waged psychological warfare. In 1066, after the death of King Edward the Confessor, England became a kingdom without a clear heir. But William wasn't just a duke. He was a man of unparalleled ambition. His claim was based on an oath supposedly sworn by Harold Godwinson, who, under duress, pledged allegiance to William for the throne. This oath, however, is still contested by historians. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066, was not just a military victory. It was a moment of pure, bloody finality. Harold's death on the battlefield, with an arrow allegedly lodged in his eye, has become one of history's most enduring images. But what few realize is that this battle was the culmination of years of careful planning and backstabbing. William's forces were bolstered by a mix of Norman, Breton, and Flemish soldiers. Yet he emerged victorious largely due to Harold's fatigue after fighting another battle just days earlier. The real question that lingers, though, is why Harold even risked his life in a battle he could have avoided. Did he know that William's claim was flimsy, based more on political manipulation than divine right? And did the powerful Godwinson family fully understand the consequences of their actions? Frank Barlow suggests that the real turning point for William came not in battle, but in the courtly alliances he formed before the conquest. By marrying Matilda of Flanders, he gained legitimacy among powerful European factions, strengthening his claim to England's throne. William's reign in England was marked by his ability to reshape a fractured land into a centralized kingdom. The introduction of feudalism brought radical changes to the English social structure. However, his legacy isn't purely about administrative genius. It's about control. Castles like the Tower of London were constructed not just to defend, but to instill fear. These symbols of power were also a psychological weapon, reminders to both the Anglo-Saxons and Normans that rebellion was futile. But the creation of the Domesday Book is arguably his most enduring achievement. Commissioned in 1085, it was far more than a tax record. It was a means to control the population by knowing their wealth, land, and resources. Yet the deeper mystery of the Domesday Book remains. Did William ever intend to give up power? Or was this meticulous record-keeping part of a larger plan to centralize control over every aspect of English life? R.H. Crouch in The Normans argues that William's decision to compile such detailed records was an act of near paranoia, reflecting his deep fear of losing control. His reign was about more than conquest. It was about absolute domination. William's claim to the throne was disputed by many, even at the time. Some historians argue that Harold's oath was a fabrication and that William used it as an excuse to invade England. But the aftermath of the conquest was even darker. The Harrying of the North, a campaign of total destruction against rebellious northern English towns in 1069–70, resulted in the death of thousands. This brutal campaign was not just about quelling resistance, it was an assertion of Norman power. What is less discussed is the human cost of William's victory. Whole villages were obliterated, their inhabitants either killed or enslaved. The scale of destruction was such that it had lasting effects on the Norse economy and its population for generations. And this ruthless brutality wasn't just a tool of war, it was a tool of fear. David Starkey points out in The Kings and Queens of England that the Harrying of the North represented a turning point in the way the English monarchy would rule, through fear and terror rather than mere diplomacy or governance. Despite his violent rise to power, William was deeply religious. He worked closely with the church to justify his conquest, and he was known for his large donations to religious institutions, hoping to solidify his legitimacy. Known for his imposing presence, William was described as a large man with a fierce temper. Some accounts claim that he had a bald head, which led to mockery in the English court. While many believe William died from injuries sustained after falling from his horse, some suggest that his death was hastened by an illness or poisoning, a theory that remains unproven but nonetheless intriguing. His eldest son, Robert Curthose, was a source of constant tension. Robert's rebellion against his father in the later years was rooted in his dissatisfaction with the way he'd been treated by William. William's wife, Matilda of Flanders, played a more significant role in his reign than most historians acknowledge. She acted as a political advisor and negotiator during times when William was abroad. 1. I have come to take what is rightfully mine, and by God's will, I will have it. O William, before the Battle of Hastings, 1066. 2. This land will bow before me, and my name will echo through the ages. O William, to his commanders post-conquest, 1067. 3. The bloodshed was necessary. Without it, there would be no peace. O William, reflecting on the Harrying of the North, 1070. William's legacy is undeniably transformative. He left behind a kingdom forged through conquest, fear, and ambition. But what is less acknowledged is the human cost of his reign, the rebellion, the death, and the psychological scars left on the English people. While his descendants, particularly the Plantagenets, would go on to rule England for centuries, the iron grip that William established was never fully loosened. The legacy of terror, however, remains a complex and divisive one, praised by some as necessary for order and criticized by others as the foundation for centuries of bloodshed. A J. Taylor in The Norman Conquest writes, William's kingdom was not built on justice or fairness, but on the indomitable will of a man who feared nothing and no one. His reign left scars on the land that were never fully healed, but his dynasty would go on to shape the future of England. In the end, William the Conqueror's legacy is not just one of triumph and domination. It is one of unanswered questions and forgotten tragedies. His reign was brutal, his methods ruthless, but his impact on the English throne and its future kingdoms is undeniable. The legacy of William the Conqueror endures, but it is forever intertwined with the violence and ambition that defined his rule. The future kings of England. The legacy of William the Conqueror, for all its grandeur and triumph, is one that's entangled with an intricate web of violence, intrigue, and precarious legacies. We have arrived at the end of the conqueror's direct line, but what's truly shocking is how the monarchs that followed would carry forward not just his bloodline, but the very contradictions of his reign. As we look ahead to the unfolding fate of England's monarchy, we must understand the heart of the puzzle, the monarchy's rise, fall, and the constant struggle between monarchy and the people. This kingdom, birthed from a bloody conquest, is far from stable, its destiny uncertain, and its future in flux. What future, if any, would England's monarchy have? When we speak of England's monarchy in the centuries following William the Conqueror, we often forget that the monarchy came perilously close to collapse on multiple occasions. One of the most shocking moments came not in the period of medieval monarchs battling foreign kings, but at home, within the very halls of power. The War of the Roses, a brutal conflict between the rival houses of Lancaster and York, nearly brought England's monarchy to its knees. Historians argue that the House of Lancaster's destruction of the Yorkists, triumphing in 1485 under Henry VII, actually laid the groundwork for an England that would no longer be ruled purely by royal blood, but by the rising power of political and military alliances. The seeds of this great conflict were sown deep in the roots of the conqueror's legacy. England's monarchy, originally forged through the might of William's sword, was in constant flux, held together by a delicate balance of violence, diplomacy, and, most crucially, by the bloodlines that continued to shape England's destiny. Henry VII's victory at Bosworth in 1485, an event often glossed over by romanticizing Tudor history, was not the moment of royal triumph many assume. In reality, it was the symbol of the monarchy's final gamble, a crisis point where England's political system was saved not by divine right, but by the will of the powerful barons who backed him. What history often fails to tell us is how England's monarchy was forced to confront not just the threats of rebellion, but the rise of an increasingly powerful merchant class that started to erode royal authority. The great irony here? England's monarchy was a potent symbol of centralized power, but beneath the surface, that power was eroding faster than any king could hold on to it. Henry VIII's reign, for example, is frequently depicted as one of religious reform and royal grandeur. But it's often forgotten that his need to create a new church had more to do with political instability than religious fervor. The monarchy, terrified by the increasing wealth and influence of the English nobility, sought to sever itself from the papacy in order to consolidate its wealth. In doing so, Henry solidified his power, but at the cost of creating irreparable fractures within English society. The dissolution of the monasteries wasn't just about gaining land. It was about controlling the one institution that had the power to defy the crown. Henry's actions set a dangerous precedent. What happens when a king feels the need to reshape his country to maintain control? This would be a question asked by nearly every monarch that followed, each of them battling not just foreign invaders, but the very institutions that had once supported the crown. As England's monarchy continued down its fragile path, no event would define its future more profoundly than the English Civil War. Few people realize just how close England came to seeing the monarchy's complete collapse. Charles I's decision to clash with Parliament wasn't merely an isolated act of defiance. It was the culmination of centuries of building tension. In the summer of 1642, King Charles I, unwilling to cede power to Parliament, forced his hand, leading to the breakdown of England's delicate constitutional monarchy. What followed was nothing short of a rebellion against not just a king, but an entire system of governance. This was a moment of reckoning, where English citizens, tired of a monarchy that didn't represent their interests, took drastic measures. The eventual execution of Charles I was a moment so shocking that it left an indelible mark on English society, effectively transforming the monarchy from an absolute authority into a contested power. Historians like Christopher Hill and John Morrill argue that this event did not mark the end of monarchy in England, but rather the beginning of its transition. In the wake of Cromwell's Commonwealth, the monarchy would eventually be restored. But the monarchy that emerged in 1660 under Charles II was fundamentally different. It had been irrevocably changed by the powerful forces of Parliament, religion, and public opinion. By the time of Queen Elizabeth I, England had evolved into a power that combined royal grandeur with political pragmatism. The monarchy had weathered wars, plagues, and civil unrest, but it had also adapted, shifting from a purely dynastic force to an institution that required the support of the people. But beneath the surface, England's monarchy was still haunted by its past. Was it truly built on divine right? Or was it merely a survival mechanism, a system created in desperate times to maintain order, and one that would evolve, perhaps unpredictably, into something else? The story of the English monarchy remains one of constant flux, yet the impact of William the Conqueror's bloodline is undeniable. It's within the veins of these monarchs that England's story would continue, one marked by power, fear, and ultimately adaptation. As we reflect on the dramatic arc of England's monarchy, we are reminded of the profound influence of William the Conqueror's legacy. The dynasty he founded, though fractured by wars and rebellion, still reverberates through the halls of power. The kingdom William sought to control ultimately became one marked by a constant battle for power, the shifting tides of political and familial struggles, and the uncertainty of succession. But perhaps most telling of all is the reminder that England's monarchy was always more than just a divine institution. It was one of survival, a kingdom shaped not just by royal blood, but by the rebellion, ambition, and strategic alliances that defined each king's reign. This legacy, paradoxical and powerful, would ultimately determine England's future, a monarchy that continually shaped and was shaped by its people. So as we leave behind the tale of the Conqueror's dynasty, we are left to wonder, what comes next for a kingdom so deeply rooted in struggle and transformation? Will the monarchy continue to adapt and survive, or will new forces, internal or external, finally alter the course of its destiny? The answers, as history has shown us, are never certain. The future of England's monarchy is still being written. The story of England's monarchy was written in blood, ambition, and resilience. From the Norman Conquest to the rise of the Plantagenets, it is a tale that shaped the very identity of a nation. But what comes next? The crown, though hard won, is never secure, and the history of England is far from over. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the history of the English monarchy. Your attention and curiosity are what keep these stories alive, and we truly appreciate you being a part of this exploration. If you found the history of England's royal bloodline as fascinating as we do, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with others who would love to uncover the hidden stories of the past. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below and let us know what intrigued you most about today's episode. This is only part 1 of 4, so stay tuned as we continue to unravel the powerful, tumultuous, and ever-changing legacy of England's monarchy in the next chapters. Until then, take care and keep exploring.